Donald Trump wants Americans to believe his unpredictability makes the country stronger. But in less than a day, his own statements put two American relationships under extraordinary pressure. One involves Oman, a security partner whose facilities matter to the United States. The other involves South Korea, a treaty ally facing a nuclear-armed North Korea. And the contradiction is becoming difficult to ignore. Trump is presenting personal rapport with authoritarian leaders as strategic leverage, while the military architecture built around American alliances is being strained by the war with Iran. That matters because foreign policy is not a television performance. When a president threatens another country, questions an alliance, moves missile defenses, or redirects military assets, people thousands of miles away have to live with the consequences. American troops have to operate under those decisions. Allies have to decide whether American commitments still mean what they used to mean. Adversaries get to calculate whether a gap has opened that they can exploit. And right now, the central question is remarkably simple. Is Trump's unpredictability actually producing leverage, or is it forcing the United States to spend military resources, alliance credibility, and strategic flexibility faster than it can replace them? Start with Oman. According to the source material, Trump was asked about parallel negotiations involving Iran and Oman and responded with an extraordinary threat. He said that if Oman got in the way, the United States would bomb it. Think about what makes that statement so unusual. Oman is not simply some country appearing randomly in a diplomatic dispute. The United States relies on access to Omani military facilities. Oman has also historically played a diplomatic role between Washington and Tehran. So the administration's strategic problem is not merely whether Trump sounded aggressive. Presidents sometimes use aggressive language deliberately. The problem is whether the threat itself damages something the United States may need. You cannot evaluate that by asking whether the statement sounded tough. You have to ask what America gains from it. What military objective becomes easier? What diplomatic objective becomes easier? What leverage does Washington acquire that it did not already possess? And what happens if Oman concludes that facilitating negotiations with Washington carries the possibility of being publicly threatened by Washington? That is the first contradiction. Trump's political brand treats unpredictability as leverage. But unpredictability only becomes leverage when the other side believes you can impose costs without imposing even greater costs on yourself. If your threat makes an adversary nervous, that can be leverage. If your threat makes your own partners nervous, that can become something very different. And here's the standard worth applying, regardless of who occupies the White House. If another president threatened a country whose facilities the American military relies upon, would supporters describe that automatically as strategic brilliance? Or would they demand an explanation of the objective? Because the burden should not be on the public to prove that every presidential threat is reckless. The administration making the threat should be able to explain what American interest it advances. Now move several thousand miles east because almost simultaneously, Trump opened another front of uncertainty. South Korea. Trump publicly complained about long-standing joint military exercises between the United States and South Korea. He described those exercises as hostile toward North Korea and emphasized his personal relationship with Kim Jong Un, saying Kim had treated him with respect. That is where Trump's worldview becomes especially important. He repeatedly evaluates international relationships through personal treatment. Who respects him, who praises him, who insults him, who appears friendly toward him, but alliances are designed specifically to survive the personalities of individual leaders. The American relationship with South Korea does not exist because one president likes another president. It exists because Washington and Seoul concluded over decades that their security interests overlap. North Korea's nuclear and missile programs are part of that calculation. And according to the source material, those programs did not disappear after Trump's highly publicized meetings with Kim Jong Un during his first term. The negotiations produced historic images and extraordinary attention, but they did not produce the denuclearization Trump had sought. That distinction matters. Diplomatic contact is not meaningless simply because it fails to solve the entire problem. Talking can reduce misunderstanding. Meetings can create channels that did not exist before. Personal diplomacy can sometimes break through institutional paralysis. That is the strongest reasonable defense of Trump's approach. Maybe he believes reducing exercises creates room for another negotiation. Maybe he believes personal engagement with Kim lowers the risk of war. Maybe he sees traditional diplomatic caution as one reason previous administrations failed to resolve the North Korean nuclear problem. Those arguments deserve to be considered. But then comes the evidence that complicates them. North Korea's military capabilities continued developing, and the source material describes North Korean troops fighting alongside Russia in Ukraine while Pyongyang receives Russian military technology in return. If that account is correct, the strategic picture is not one of a North Korea that became harmless because its leader maintained a respectful relationship with an American president. It is a North Korea becoming intertwined with another American adversary while retaining the capabilities that made the Korean alliance necessary in the first place. So, which should matter more in American foreign policy? A leader's respectful treatment of the president or measurable changes in that country's military behavior? That question is bigger than Trump. It is a basic test of whether national security is being organized around institutions and interests or around personalities. And there is another piece of this story that makes the South Korea issue more serious. The source material says part of the THAAD missile defense capability associated with defending South Korea was moved toward the Middle East because of the Iran war. That creates a real resource problem. Military power is not infinite. A missile defense system positioned in one theater cannot simultaneously perform the same mission somewhere else. A carrier sent toward one crisis is unavailable for another. An interceptor fired today has to be replaced tomorrow. A crew operating continuously eventually needs rest and maintenance. This is where political rhetoric collides with military arithmetic. The United States can possess the most powerful military in the world and still face scarcity. And according to the reporting described in the source, that scarcity is already becoming visible. The Washington Post is cited as reporting that America's supply of a drone considered important for monitoring and defending the Strait of Hormuz has fallen by roughly 25% during the Iran conflict. 25%. Do not let that number disappear into the background. It means the debate about Trump's foreign policy is no longer simply about whether his statements are unconventional. It is about consumption of finite military capability. Every prolonged conflict forces choices. What gets deployed? What gets replenished? What gets postponed? What remains available if another crisis begins? And that leads directly back to Asia. The source also describes the Japan-based American aircraft carrier leaving the region, breaking with a posture that had persisted for decades. Again, one movement does not prove the United States has abandoned Asia. Militaries reposition assets constantly. Operational requirements change. Temporary deployments should not automatically be transformed into sweeping political conclusions. But combine the movements. Resources are being redirected toward Iran. Missile defense capacity has been shifted. A key surveillance capability has reportedly been depleted, and while those pressures are developing, Trump is publicly questioning exercises with South Korea and praising his relationship with Kim Jong Un. Individually, each event might have an explanation. Together, they create a strategic question the administration has to answer. How many commitments can the United States simultaneously weaken before allies begin building plans that assume Washington may not be there? And this is exactly where political information becomes dangerous, because one dramatic quote can easily swallow the larger record. A supporter can circulate Trump's toughest sentence, an opponent can circulate his strangest sentence. Neither tells you whether the underlying strategy works. Don't get played. The evidence discipline for American politics teaches you to move from reacting to testing, using tools like the evidence ladder and claim ledger. The complete digital ebook is only $9 one time. Open the description and click the first link to get your copy for $9. The same purchase link is in the first pinned comment. The next political claim demanding your reaction will arrive quickly. Now apply that method to the military picture, because this story becomes much more consequential when you examine what people who previously worked around Trump have said about his decision making. Former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was reported by NBC News to have called Trump a vulgar version of moron after a national security meeting during Trump's first administration. Former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly later described Trump's dishonesty and the transactional nature of his relationships in extraordinarily harsh terms. Those statements matter because Tillerson and Kelly were not outside commentators trying to interpret Trump through television appearances. They served inside his administration, but they also need to be used carefully. Their criticism is testimony about their assessment of Trump. It is not independent proof that every later Trump decision is wrong. That distinction is essential. You do not prove the Oman threat was strategically damaging by quoting Rex Tillerson. You evaluate the Oman threat by examining American interests in Oman and asking what the threat accomplishes. You do not prove Trump's North Korea policy is failing because John Kelly criticized Trump's personality. You examine North Korea's nuclear program, its military behavior, its relationship with Russia, America's forced posture, and the measurable results of Trump's diplomacy. That is what evidence discipline looks like. And interestingly, when you do that, the case becomes more serious rather than less serious, because you no longer need to speculate about Trump's personality. You can examine outcomes. Trump met Kim Jong Un. The nuclear problem remained. North Korea's capabilities advanced. North Korean cooperation with Russia deepened. American military resources are now being pulled toward another theater. Trump is questioning exercises with South Korea, and he is simultaneously describing Kim in personal terms centered on respect. Those facts do not prove Trump intends to abandon South Korea. They do show why Seoul has reason to examine whether America's security commitment could become increasingly dependent on the preferences of one president. That possibility has consequences even before any formal policy changes. Alliances depend heavily on credibility. Credibility is difficult to measure because it exists partly inside the expectations of governments. But the mechanism is easy to understand. Imagine you are responsible for South Korean national security. Your country faces a nuclear-armed neighbor. For decades, your defense strategy has been integrated with the United States. Then an American president begins questioning joint exercises, praises the opposing leader's treatment of him, and redirects some military capabilities because America is fighting elsewhere. You do not have the luxury of simply assuming everything will eventually return to normal. Your job is to prepare for the possibility that it will not. That can push allies toward greater strategic independence. It can encourage debates over weapons, force structures, and relationships that once seemed unnecessary. And as one expert in the source material argues, South Korea has options. It does not have to design its entire security architecture permanently around Washington. China understands that. Russia understands that. North Korea certainly understands that. This is why alliances are not charity. American presidents do not maintain alliances merely because they enjoy helping other countries. The United States built alliances because they multiply American influence, they provide access, they create intelligence networks, they distribute military burdens, they complicate adversaries' planning, they allow Washington to shape regional security without physically controlling every piece of territory itself. So when someone says, "Why should America care what South Korea thinks?" the answer is not sentimental. Because South Korea's choices affect the balance of power in Asia. The same principle applies to Oman. The United States benefits when countries allow access, facilitate diplomacy, share intelligence, coordinate militarily, or simply decide that cooperation with Washington is safer than opposition to Washington. Threatening allies and partners may occasionally be justified when vital interests collide, but if you choose that path, the strategic benefit should be identifiable. Otherwise, toughness becomes theater, and theater can be extremely expensive when performed with aircraft carriers, missile defense systems, and military alliances. Now consider the strongest defense of Trump's broader philosophy. His supporters could reasonably argue that the traditional foreign policy establishment has accumulated its own failures. Decades of conventional diplomacy did not denuclearize North Korea. American alliances can create dependency. Allies sometimes underinvest in defense because they expect Washington to carry disproportionate burdens. Traditional experts have made disastrous predictions and supported disastrous wars, all true concerns. A president is allowed to challenge consensus. In fact, sometimes a president should. The question is whether challenging consensus produces a better strategy. That is the standard, not whether the establishment dislikes it, not whether cable television commentators are horrified, not whether Trump's language violates diplomatic etiquette. Does the alternative work? If Trump's personal relationship with Kim produces measurable reductions in the North Korean threat, that matters. If reducing exercises produces verifiable concessions, that matters. If threatening Oman produces a meaningful strategic advantage without damaging American access or diplomacy, that matters. But if the concessions flow primarily from Washington, while adversaries preserve or expand their capabilities, then the unconventional approach cannot be defended simply by calling it unconventional. What evidence would genuinely change your conclusion here? That is the reflection worth having, because serious political judgment requires the possibility of being persuaded by new evidence. For me, evidence of verifiable North Korean concessions would materially strengthen Trump's argument. Evidence that changes to military exercises produced a concrete security benefit would matter. Evidence that Oman's behavior directly endangered American forces in a way requiring the threat described would matter. But without those facts, personal respect from Kim Jong Un is not a substitute for strategic results. And now return to Iran, because Iran is what connects these apparently separate stories. The source material describes Trump's war with Iran as consuming military assets and creating pressure across America's global posture. That is the hidden cost of opening or prolonging any major conflict. The public sees the immediate battlefield. Military planners see the opportunity cost. Every interceptor sent to one region is an interceptor unavailable somewhere else. Every aircraft requiring maintenance affects readiness. Every carrier repositioned changes the calculations in another theater. Every depleted stockpile narrows the choices available during the next emergency. And adversaries do not politely wait their turn. China does not stop planning because the United States is occupied with Iran. North Korea does not freeze its missile program because Washington has redirected resources. Russia does not suspend its objectives because American planners are busy elsewhere. That is why global strategy requires prioritization. A president can promise dominance everywhere. The military still has to allocate actual equipment. The 25% decline in the drone supply described in the source is important precisely because it transforms an abstract argument about strength into a measurable constraint. And once constraints appear, political leaders have to choose. Which theater matters most? Which ally receives what? Which mission can tolerate risk? What gets replenished first? Those choices eventually reveal the real strategy more clearly than speeches do. This is also why Trump's public behavior matters without requiring amateur psychological diagnosis. We do not need to determine whether Trump is stable or unstable. That is not something this evidence can establish. We can evaluate whether his statements align with American policy objectives. We can compare what he says about allies with what the United States needs from those allies. We can compare his claims about adversaries with their documented behavior. We can measure military resource consumption. And we can ask whether the resulting posture gives Washington more options or fewer. That is a much stronger criticism because it does not depend on mind reading. It depends on results. And the emerging result described in this source is an America trying to sustain pressure in the Middle East while simultaneously creating uncertainty in Asia. That does not mean American power is collapsing. It does not establish that South Korea has been abandoned. It does not prove Oman will sever cooperation with Washington. Those would be conclusions stronger than the evidence permits. But something narrower is already visible. American strategic flexibility is being tested. Military resources are finite. Long-standing partners are hearing unusual threats and unusual doubts, and America's adversaries are watching the same movements. At some point, presidential unpredictability stops being an asset if your allies become more uncertain about you than your adversaries are afraid of you. Where exactly is that line? There is no mathematical answer, but we can identify warning signs. One is when partners begin planning around the possibility of American absence. Another is when resources consumed by one conflict visibly weaken posture elsewhere. Another is when personal relationships with foreign leaders begin appearing more important in presidential explanations than measurable changes in those governments' behavior. And another is when the administration cannot clearly explain what concession America receives in return for altering long-standing commitments. Those are standards that should apply to any president. Reverse the political parties and run the test again. If a Democratic president publicly praised a hostile nuclear leader for treating him respectfully, questioned military exercises with an American ally, shifted defensive resources away from that ally, and threatened another country whose facilities the United States relied upon, would Republicans accept unpredictability as a complete explanation? They shouldn't. And Democrats should not accept it from one of their own either. National security is too expensive, and the consequences are too real for presidential personality to become the standard by which strategy is judged. The central contradiction we started with, therefore, has an answer, although not an absolute one. Trump's unpredictability may sometimes create tactical uncertainty for adversaries. The record presented here cannot establish that unpredictability has zero strategic value. But the same record shows a much harder problem. The United States is consuming military capability in the Iran conflict, while Trump's public decisions and statements are introducing uncertainty into relationships the United States depends upon elsewhere. The Iran war is pressuring resources, the South Korea relationship is being questioned, North Korea's capabilities remain, Pyongyang's cooperation with Russia has deepened, American assets have moved, Oman has been threatened despite its strategic relationship with Washington, and none of that can be erased by saying Kim Jong Un respects Donald Trump. Personal respect is not deterrence, a meeting is not denuclearization, a threat is not automatically leverage, and unpredictability is not automatically strategy. The unresolved questions are important. We do not yet know whether Trump's comments about South Korean exercises will translate into a permanent restructuring of the alliance. We do not know what long term effect his Oman threat will have. We do not know how quickly depleted American systems can be replaced or how long current military deployments will remain necessary. Those uncertainties should restrain conclusions. They should not erase the evidence already available. The people with authority here are the president and the officials responsible for translating presidential decisions into military and diplomatic policy. The consequences extend far beyond Washington. American service members carry out these deployments. Allied governments adjust their security planning. Taxpayers finance the replacement of depleted systems, and adversaries incorporate every visible gap into their own calculations. So the political standard should be straightforward. A president who breaks with decades of policy may be right, but the more consequential the break, the stronger the evidence required to show that the new strategy leaves America safer. Not louder, not more unpredictable, safer. That is the question I want you to consider. When American allies are forced to prepare for American unpredictability, at the same moment, American adversaries are expanding their capabilities. Who is actually gaining leverage? And that broader information problem will outlive this story. The next speech, viral clip, military claim, poll, court filing, statistic, or synthetic video will demand a reaction before most people have checked what it actually proves. Don't Get Played gives you a repeatable way to move from reacting to testing and from borrowed certainty to evidence you can defend. The digital ebook is $9. The link is in the description and first pinned comment. Open the description and click the first link to get your copy. Because political accountability begins with one discipline: never give a claim more certainty than the evidence has earned.